org comm people. Welcome to the second short lecture from organizational communication. And in this one, we're going to talk about types of control. So in the first lecture, we discussed the fact that control is an integral part of any complex organization. And control is required in order to place the goals of the organization above the needs of the individual and wants of the individual members. And so in this lecture, we're going to talk about the different kinds of control. So when we talk about control, we talk about control mechanisms, right? And we know, again, that control is a central feature of complex organizations. We also know that because the goals and interests of employees in the larger organization often conflict, right, we have to have forms of control to achieve coordinated, goal-oriented behavior. And so there are 5 different kinds of control mechanisms that we'll talk about in this short lecture. And those are direct control, technological, bureaucratic, ideological, and disciplinary control. And we'll talk about each one. So when we talk about direct control, this is really sort of the simplest or most obvious form of control. And so the simplest way to control employees is to direct them in very explicit ways and monitor their behavior to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do, right? And according to the direct control model, what we find are what we call superior subordinate relationships. So somebody's in charge, right? The superior person, so that's the manager, right? Maybe, or the president of the organization, or administration at a college. And then there are subordinates, right? The workers. And so the relationship is very much one is in charge and the other is not. Now this model of direct control became very popular during the Industrial Revolution. So again, if you missed this in history class, right, this took place during the 18th and 19th centuries, began in Great Britain, and then moved over to the United States. And that was when we started building factories and when we came up with the assembly line, right? And it's when the modern era, in its purest form, comes into being. And so during the Industrial Revolution, we see that for the first time, we have supervisors that are employed to make sure that workers perform their tasks rather than taking long breaks or talking to coworkers, right? And this is really where we see the first instances of massive direct control mechanisms being employed, right? So across factories all across Europe, all across the United States, we see these superior subordinate relationships being formed, and the supervisor becomes a major figure in people's everyday lives. Now, sort of a modern example of this would be Jim Beam. Many of you may be familiar with Jim Beam's products. And in 2001, Jim Beam got into a bunch of trouble for restricting the number and length, duration, of toilet breaks that their employees were taking, right? That's a very obvious form of direct control, right? It's direct control to the point where they say you're only allowed to stop working and go to the bathroom this many times a day and for this long. That's sort of the ultimate example of direct control, right? Now, technological control is another control mechanism that's less direct than direct control, right? What we find with technological control is that technology is often used to control the kinds of work that people do and the speed at which they do it. And this can affect both employees and customers, right? So think about things like the assembly line, or if you work at McDonald's, dispensing sodas at McDonald's, right? These things, all the work on the assembly line has been analyzed and streamlined to make sure that you fasten, X number of screws in an hour, right? You should be able to do that consistently time in and time out. And the speed of the assembly line, right, how fast the parts go by, those dictate how quickly you work. The length of time it takes to dispense a soda at McDonald's, right? They know, believe me, the folks at McDonald's know how long it takes to pour a soda. Now, technological control at McDonald's, for example. I know I keep harping on McDonald's, but it's also exerted on the customer, right? So it's not just employees. They do things like they make the seats purposefully hard and uncomfortable in McDonald's so you don't spend too much time hanging out in the restaurant, right? Hot coffee, right? I don't know, you're probably too young to remember this, but probably about 20 years ago or so, a woman sued McDonald's because the coffee was too hot and it burned her when she drank it, right? And people said, oh, well, what the hell, this is silly, like people shouldn't be allowed to sue over hot coffee. But the truth is that it turned out that the chain was superheating the coffee, making it super hot, so that old people, retirees, wouldn't go there and keep getting free cups of coffee all day and taking up space in the restaurant because they're taking up space that, and consuming products, right, that could go to paying customers, right, new customers. Two, everything about Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all those things are built around technological control, right? Now, it's different with those than it is with McDonald's. At Twitter, at Facebook, those are designed from the perspective of technological control to keep you on there as long as possible, right? They don't want to move you through. They want you hanging out. They want you on Twitter all day. They want you on Instagram all day, right? So, the management view of this, from management view, this dictates the rate of production, how quickly things are made, and it helps confine the worker to a particular location, right? So with technological control, I can make sure that you're where you're at when you're supposed to be there and that you're doing what you're supposed to do through technology. Again, it's sort of a funny video, but it shows you, right? I won't show this now, but if you watch it, it shows you or illustrates for you how the speed of the production line, right, how fast things come across, dictate how quickly you need to work. So another form, or one of the more obvious forms of technological control, is just in straight up surveillance, right? In today's workplace, you're rarely ever certain of whether or not you're being monitored, right? So even if you have a work from home job where you're not at work, right, oftentimes if you're working on a laptop that's supplied by your employer, they have things like keystroke counting applications installed on your computer to see what you're writing and how quickly you're doing it, right? Now, this idea of being surveilled, of having people watching you and not knowing about it, right, not knowing when they're doing it, this is related to an idea that's attributed to two philosophers, right? So this is what the French philosopher Foucault called panopticism, right? So the panopticism, the idea behind it, was originally conceived of by Jeremy Bentham. This is Jeremy Bentham right here, by the way, the English philosopher who came up with a design for a prison called the panopticon. And so this is a panopticon. So you will note the way this works. In the photo, there is a guard tower in the center of the prison. Here are the prisoners' cells. Now, they don't have the bars up in this one because it's an abandoned prison, but you get the idea, right? So all the prisoners are backlit by the windows, right? But you can't see in the turret. You can't see the guard. So at any given time, the guard could be in here, and he can't be seen, but he could be watching all of these prisoners, any or all of them. And Bentham's idea was that in doing this, because the prisoners didn't know at any given time whether or not they were being watched, they would always act as if they were being watched, right? So this is really kind of a sick idea when you think about it, right? And honestly, Bentham was kind of a sick dude. But it's a way of exerting control without ever, ideally, you don't even have to be in here. Just the existence of the tower will keep people under control because they don't know about whether or not they're being watched, right? And so that's what's so clever and so evil about it in a way. Now, I should mention to you as well, it's interesting, Jeremy Bentham taught at the University College of London, and when he died, he stipulated that he wanted his body stuffed and put on display in the college, and it was, and this is it. This is his stuffed body, and this is a wax head here, and this is his real head, right? His mummified head. And what's kind of fun about this is that for a long time, students at that college used to pull pranks and steal his head and hide it and do all kinds of fun things with it. But yeah, so Bentham was kind of a strange cat. So that's the panopticon, right? The same idea works with police, right? I don't know if anybody has been hanging out in Henry County, but if you notice the Henry County police going by, their windows are smoked, right? They're so dark you can't see into the car. They do that for a reason. There's a reason that police wear mirrored shades, right? And they do that so that you don't know whether they're looking at you or not. And you kind of have to assume that they are, right? It's a power play. It's about control. Now, bureaucratic control, right? This is as we go along, by the way, these become less and less direct forms of control. So bureaucratic control, that's all about rules, formal structures, and roles that both enable people to do their jobs and constrain their other activities. So your employee handbook is a form of bureaucratic control, for example, right? And then finally, ideological control. And this is probably the least direct form of control, but again, also very, very effective. And this is the idea that you develop a system of values and beliefs with which employees are expected to identify, right? And the idea is that when employees are appropriately socialized into the organization's system of beliefs and values, they should have internalized the sort of taken for granted understanding of what it means to work in the best interest of the organization. Another word for this is corporate culture. So Chick-fil-A, for example, does a really good job of this. When you go to work for Chick-fil-A, they have a sort of a really amazing kind of corporate culture where by the time you're done with the training, you're supposed to understand what is, innately in your very soul, what's in the best interest of Chick-fil-A and act accordingly, right? That's ideological control. Another video you can check out when you want that really just has to do with camaraderie in the military. This, again, is another example of ideological control. And then finally, we come to disciplinary control. And this is really not about being disciplined by the management. Think of this as self-disciplinary control. So this is sort of a hard concept, but we understand that the individual in this situation is both the subject, right, makes his or her own decisions and choice of goals, and the object, the target of both self-discipline and corporate institutional efforts to shape identity, of knowledge. So in other words, disciplinary control is about controlling oneself and doing it in accordance with the rules and understanding of the organization, right? So the reason you don't go out in the middle of the academic quad and pound down beers in the middle of the day is because there's a certain degree of disciplinary control there that's going on. You won't let yourself do that because you understand that it's not in your best interest as a student. People will think poorly of you. You might be subject to direct control, reprisals by the administration, and so on, right? So disciplinary control is really kind of self-control, but it's self-control that arises out of one's interaction with the organization itself. So 3 important things to remember about control. Number 1, most organizations use multiple control mechanisms. So they'll use technological, ideological, direct, right, and use them in a combination of different ways, right? Also, these forms of control operate with decreasing levels of direct coercion, right? So direct control is the strictest, where they make you do things. And as you move down the scale towards disciplinary control, right, that's more about controlling yourself, right, in the interest of the organization. And then finally, more sophisticated forms of control require more sophisticated levels of communication. So to get people to self-discipline, right, to get people to act in the interest of the organization without even giving it a second thought, that's only achieved through communication. All right, that's it for this short lecture. Thanks for checking it out.